Hello Internet, Seth Skorkowski, and today we'll be taking a look at the classic Call of Cthulhu adventure, The Vanishing Conjurer. Written by Mike Lewis and Simon Price, the adventure was published in 1986 by Games Workshop under license from Chaosium. But one thing that makes this module particularly cool is that it is a double adventure, the second one being the Statue of the Sorcerer, which is on the opposite side. So the module doesn't have a back as much as it has two fronts, with each of them, it starts at page 1 and then goes all the way through to the middle where we have the handout section in the middle, and then you flip it over and it starts at page 1 and goes all the way through until we reach the middle again, which is pretty cool. Now, one other thing with this book, which is interesting but I find pretty annoying, is that this is taller than all of my other Call of Cthulhu books, or really any of my RPG books when it comes down to it. To show you, it was just a copy of Pulp Cthulhu here, and if you line up the bottom, you can see that this book is just a little bit taller than this hardback Call of Cthulhu book. And it's actually so tall that it will not fit on certain bookshelves. For example, this shelf, the top shelf behind me, this book will not fit on it because it's a little bit too tall, which I find just a little bit annoying, but that is just the way that all of the Games Workshop Call of Cthulhu books are, where they're just a little bit taller than the rest of your collection is going to be. The scenario is 23 pages. It's set in London during the 1920s. However, the module even suggests that you could easily move it back 30 years to be used for Cthulhu by Gaslight, which is pretty easy to do and in some ways more appropriate, which is exactly what I did, incorporating it into our current Cthulhu by Gaslight campaign, and not just 7th edition Cthulhu by Gaslight, but Pulp Gaslight. The adventure is a missing persons case, focusing on stage magicians and a stage magicians club, which the player characters are to infiltrate. And it ends with a very dramatic and action-heavy climax. However, there are some problem areas with this adventure, some railroady bits, some assumptions about what the characters are going to do without really giving them a reason to do that, or any sort of plans if they decide to do something else instead. So there's just a few other bits that keepers are going to want to know about and look out for before they run this adventure themselves. So that's what we're going to talk about: my praises, my criticisms, and my suggestions as a game master who has successfully run this adventure. Hey, and I'm Jack the NPC. And is this your card? No. Dang it. I'm here to give it to you from a player's side of things, as I go from looking for a missing magician to saving part of the royal family, and asking some pretty difficult questions such as, is this your card? Still not my card. But before we go any further, I must warn you that there will be spoilers. So any players in the audience, please stop here. But send your game masters this way to learn how to run this adventure for you. But if you keep going and you spoil yourself, you'll be sawn in half. Okay, keepers, let's get this thing started. Now, first off, while the adventure does offer us several handouts, because the adventure is so old, you can find some alternative and much prettier additional handouts online. Now, some of which I used and modified for our campaign, such as the Prospero House has some extremely detailed account of their modified version that they use for convention play, including an 11-page summary version of the scenario with all of their modifications, such as in this one, the setup is now that the player characters are a company of stage magicians about to begin a European tour. So I took this summary that they did and I edited it to follow more of the original plot, but with many of the changes that they made, plus my own changes, including making it a Gaslight era and for Pulp, and my version came to 16 pages. So in the video description below, you can find the links to several sites out there with the summaries and their handouts, plus my own modified summary and handouts that I used when I ran this adventure. Now, you still will need the scenario itself because these are more of summary notes written for a keeper who is at least familiar and has read the full module itself, kind of a condensed version that a keeper can quickly reference and look through in-game, because it's a lot easier to use that than trying to use this module. So it really just cuts to all the meat of all the details that a game master is going to want to be able to reference quickly in a game session. But you can find a link for all of that down in the video description below. The backstory is that several years before, the stage magician Ching Lung Su was extremely popular in London, dazzling huge audiences with his tricks. Then 10 years ago, he left London for China to study the ancient arts, but also to avoid the Great War. While he was there, he encountered a cult who worshipped a creature called Lan Shi, which is really actually just a star vampire that they thought was a god. Qinglong Su stole several of the cult's tomes, learning the real magic inside and incorporating many of the minor spells into his performances and just passing them off as simple tricks. He returned to London 3 years ago and opened up a club called the Inner Brotherhood of Magicians, which only accepts stage magicians as members. However, 1 year ago, the Chinese cultist tracked Su down. However, by this point, Su's sanity was gone, and he had become a believer in this god. So he set himself up as the new leader of this cult and turned the Brotherhood House into the cult's headquarters, and together they plan to turn a large upcoming performance into a bloody ceremony to summon Lan Shi back into our world. Now, real quick, the character of Qinglong Su is very clearly a nod to two very real stage magicians, Qingling Fu, a world-famous Chinese magician, and his rival, Qingling Su, a white dude pretending to be Chinese who copied Fu's act and then became insanely popular, and also died on stage in 1918 when a bullet catch trick went terribly, terribly wrong. Wildly fascinating history there with these two. Anyway, the adventure opens up with the investigators receiving a message from their old friend, a theatrical agent named Howard Horn, asking them to come to a magic show the next day in the West End. Again, I used and modified some much nicer handouts for this when I ran this game. At the show, Howard tells them to pay special attention to the final act. Now, the show itself is actually pretty bad and pretty amateur, but the final magician the performer is a German man named Karl Weiss, or the Amazing Karl as he calls himself. And he is better than all of the others, with his big finale being making a bunch of ducks appear from an empty tub. Wow, that was something. Seriously, is there a reason that he wanted us to watch this crappy magic show? Or was Howard just wanting to murder my Friday night? After the show, Howard takes the investigators to a pub to explain his problem. One of his clients, an up-and-coming magician named Philip Leclerc, has been working on a new act, a twist on the classic Vanishing trick. Howard had loaned some money to him to support Leclerc as he worked on this trick, but Leclerc had become stuck trying to figure out how the device should work. So Howard had recommended Leclerc check out the Brotherhood of Magicians and that he had heard about from other people. So a couple weeks later, Leclerc shows up in his office saying how he's not only made great progress with this trick, but how this trick would now revolutionize magic forever. And he showed Howard some crumpled plans for this apparatus that he was designing, but that was the last that Howard ever saw his friend. So, your conjurer who was working on a disappearing trick vanished. Interesting. That's the name of the adventure. Nice. Howard Horn says that the day before, he dropped by the Chancellor Theater to scope out some potential talent while they were all practicing and setting up. And while he was there, he saw Karl Weiss practicing his vanishing trick that employed a device almost exactly like the one that was in Leclerc's drawing. So he is convinced that Weiss is somehow involved in Leclerc's disappearance, but he can't prove it. Now, the police didn't really seem to put much effort into searching for Leclerc. They likely believe this is all some sort of publicity stunt. So Howard asked the investigators to come up with some solid proof that Karl Weiss or someone else was responsible for Leclerc's disappearance that he could then take to the police to get somebody to find Leclerc. Now, the adventure doesn't mention anything about whatever sort of payment is involved here, so keepers, if Horn is an old friend, maybe this could just be a favor that they're doing to help an old buddy out. Otherwise, you might want to figure out what it is that Horn can do or is willing to pay the investigators to do this. Maybe it'll be money, maybe it'll be free theater tickets for the next year, something else like that the player characters might value. Searching Leclerc's apartment doesn't really find anything useful. However, I took a couple of the changes from the Prospero House remix. The first is a card from the Inner Brotherhood of Magicians. Now, this isn't a membership card, but a tryout card, but the player characters are not going to know that yet until they get to the Brotherhood. The second is a book of magic tricks belonging to Karl Weiss. The adventure has it where Weiss and Leclerc were collaborating on some tricks together, but Weiss will deny even knowing Leclerc if the player characters ask him about it, so adding Weiss's book of parlor tricks gives some evidence that it's very likely they really did know each other. Now, going to the Inner Brotherhood of Magicians, they'll be denied entry without membership cards. However, tryouts to join are at 11 a.m. every day, and the player characters can apply if they have a letter of recommendation, which of course Howard Horn can give them. Now, if they say yes, I gave them their own tryout cards that they could fill out with their names. Now, the tryouts can be a really fun part of this adventure. They're actually one of the really big appeals for me for this adventure. Now, of course, the player characters, you can just make a skill roll, and the adventure offers a new skill called Conjuring, which starts at 15%. Now, also, if the character hires a teacher, possibly through Howard Horn, who knows a lot of magicians that they can be rented out to teach somebody a trick, they can learn a one-lesson, simple trick that they can raise their conjuring skill for that trick alone by 10% if they don't have anything in conjuring, which would bring that up to 25, or by 5% if they have already put some points into conjuring. However, for my game, and because we were using 7th edition Call of Cthulhu, and that has the sleight of hand skill, which handles little card tricks and that type of thing, that starts at 10%, which is lower, but it is more likely that a character might have put a couple points in sleight of hand because that is just a really useful skill for player characters to have. Also, I offered that if they used an instruction book, such as the one they found in LeClaire's apartment, or some special prop like a collapsible bird cage or other device, it would grant a bonus die. And if they used both, it could grant a double bonus die for this. Now, hiring a private tutor, I said would add 15% to that specific trick alone, evening it out with the original version, because that would then come to 25%. Also, the player characters do not have to use sleight of hand here. They don't have to actually do like a card trick or a coin trick. They might choose a different skill, such as locksmithing for some sort of escape act, or hypnosis, or some cool, tricks where they're throwing daggers or using whip tricks. Or if they have a really high psychology skill, they could do a mentalist routine, or whatever else it is that the players might come up with based off whatever it is their characters are really good at. Now, finally, if the player used their social skills in this, kind of describing how their showmanship was in their performance, I would also grant a bonus die. After all, showmanship is a huge part of being a stage magician, so if they had that presence, that would give them a bonus die on whatever their trick was. The big thing to remember here is you want to give your players lots of options of different sort of things they could do as their trick to get inducted into the Brotherhood, as well as ways they could come up with kooky ideas to improve their chances. Remember, the whole point of all of this is you want them to have fun coming up with crazy ideas of what it is their character is good enough at that they could make it in, and also allow a really good likelihood and potential that most, if not all, of the player characters can get inducted. Finally, and this is a really fun option that the module suggests and that 2 of my players did elect to do when we ran this adventure, is instead of it being a dice roll for some skill check, you can have the players perform for the table a simple magic trick, just right in front of everybody at the table. The module even offers 4 simple card tricks that they might learn and perform for the rest of the table. Now, because some of these might require a little practice and a little preparation on the player's part, keepers should tell your players a few days in advance of the game that one part of this adventure might be completed with an optional in-person magic trick. And then, send them these examples as a good place to start looking for one. Maybe send them the web address for any websites that might have some others for coins or card tricks or anything like that. But give your players enough time to find and learn a trick prior to the session. And I think this is just a really, really fun option that you can do. Now, as my game, if the player pulled off doing a physical magic trick instead of doing just a simple skill roll, I still had the player check the box next to their sleight of hand skill as if they had successfully rolled it because they had completed the task. Once any of the player characters pass this test and they make it in, hopefully a few of them, if not all the player characters, are able to make it into the Brotherhood, but they're given cards to show that they're first level magicians in the order, and they're given a tour of the ground floor of the Brotherhood's building. Now, any player characters I determined that made an extreme success on this roll, they determined such great promise as stage magicians that I also gave those specific characters a tour of the upper floor where the second level members could go, some offering a little taste of what it is those player characters might aspire to in a few short months. And I also made second level cards for some of the members, and those were in yellow. And I figured the player characters, they might determine, who some second level members are and try to steal their card or maybe forge a card on themselves in order to go upstairs and pass the guard. Now, one thing with the Brotherhood building is that it only has one entrance, which is just the front door, which always seems really weird to me when RPG maps only have one door for an entire house. So with a little Photoshop, I added a kitchen door along the side and a rear door at the back, giving a few opportunities for any break-in attempts or anything like that by characters that might not have made it into the Brotherhood, or if they want to sneak in and not let anybody know they were there because they didn't sign in. Now, once again, you can download all of my modified maps and handouts in the video description below. It is worth mentioning that the module specifies that only men are inducted into the club, but I say screw that. I'm not going to tell any of my players that have women characters that they can't join in this adventure. So some women characters, yeah, they might be able to disguise themselves, or a woman player character who's, one of ours was an actress and she had great acting and disguise skills, but I just simply removed this hurdle altogether, this kind of no girls allowed rule, because it doesn't add anything meaningful to the adventure. After all, while women magicians certainly were rare, they did exist, such as Minerva, Queen of Mystery in the early 1900s, Adelaide Herman, the Queen of Magic in the 1890s, Talma, Queen of Coins, a sleight of hand artist also in the 1890s, Thelma Griffin, Queen of Handcuffs from the early 1900s. Evidently, Queen was a really popular title for women magicians back in the day. Anyway, the point of all this is that I just ignored the men-only rule, and other keepers out there, you should totally feel free to ignore that as well if that's what you want to do. This is also a pretty good time to add that because I was running this with Pulp Cthulhu, I gave Sue this badass tough enforcer bodyguard sorceress who was named Jade Ling, who was the second in command of the cult. And she was this towering, tall, femme fatale Chinese woman who served as Sue's lovely assistant during the show's finale. Now, speaking of that, the Brotherhood is hosting a big annual charity show on June 28th. This year's event is going to be bigger than the previous years, with members of the government and royalty who are going to be attending. Qinglong Su is going to be performing in public for the first time in 10 years. Now, while only second-level members are going to also be performing at this big show, all members of the Brotherhood are expected to attend this event because they're going to be presented on stage for the big show finale. Whoa, the 28th? We didn't get this job until the night of the 22nd. It's going to take us maybe 2 days to find out about the Brotherhood and take the test and get inducted, which leaves us, 3 or 4 days before I'm going to be on a stage before the Prime Minister and part of the royal family? I got to figure out what I'm going to wear for all of this. Guys, we got to find this missing magician right away, because I got some shopping to do. Exploring the Brotherhood house, they can meet several NPCs, hear some rumors, and they can learn that Carl Weiss, for the past few weeks, has exclusively booked the locked practice room up on the upper floor. Now, of course, getting up there is going to require getting past the guard that's at the base of the stairs. Now, the adventure also places a guard at the top of the stairs who's keeping an eye on the locked room and Sue's quarters. Now, personally, I didn't have this second guard at the top, just, sitting in a chair at the top of the stairs, but patrolling around the floor. That way, if the player characters, they sneak past the sentry who's stationed at the bottom, they don't just immediately encounter a second sentry guard that's just kind of sitting at the top unmoving. That way, maybe that once they get past the bottom one, they can time their movements to try to avoid this upstairs guard. And I find that just a lot more exciting than just repeating the exact same obstacle immediately after the first. There isn't much to be found in Sue's quarters, but one thing that I added was he had this really fancy inlaid armoire, and the investigators, if they checked it out, they could slide these panels of this armoire around like a puzzle box, and it opened up a secret compartment with a bunch of money and jewelry inside of it. Now, the idea behind this is that, if Sue tries to escape and leave town, he's going to first come here to get all his money and everything in order to do it. Which, of course, we took that money and kept it for ourselves, though in hindsight, I really wish we had stuck something really funny and weird inside that hidden compartment for him to find later on as just a big screw you. In the attic, they'll find the cult's altar with a big mural on the wall that looks like a body draining of blood. I also stuck the illustration from the backstory portion of the module up on the opposite wall as a mural. That way the player characters and the players could, see this really nice art. It really seems a tragedy to me how many illustrations and adventures that the players never ever get to see. So I try to find any excuse that I can to share the illustrations from the entire module whenever I can. Researching some of the symbols that they find find around the place, such as the big dragon symbol or some of the murals that they found upstairs, the investigators can discover an account by a British explorer who once encountered this cult in China. Now, because the text on this is just so damn difficult to read, I updated this handout to be just a little bit more legible. And then I also moved the date from the 1870s to the 1840s because, I was running this in the Gaslight era. Once again, download link in the video description below to anyone out there who might want my handout. Okay, so what is going on here is a couple of weeks back after joining the Brotherhood, Philip Leclerc hit it off with Carl Weiss, a second-level member with a reputation for stealing magic tricks. Leclerc got his hands on one mythos tome that was in Sue's office. Now, while he was unable to read the Chinese writing, the illustrations showed a device similar to what Leclerc was trying to design for his vanish trick. Meanwhile, Weiss has been taking a ton of private lessons from Sue. Now, Sue was working on a big project for this coming charity event, and he asked Weiss if he could put Weiss's name on the practice room checkout. That way nobody would know that Sue was working on a big surprise for everybody. So Weiss has no idea what is going on inside that locked room. He merely allows Sue to say that Weiss is the one that checked it out. Now, Leclerc, excited about this big breakthrough, showed the book to Weiss, who recognized this book as having come from Sue's office. Now, Weiss asked Sue about it when he had his next practice with him, and Sue just kind of played it off like, oh yeah, I loaned that to him. But then Sue called Leclerc up to the practice room, confronted Leclerc about stealing this mythos tome, and then using the mythos gate that he'd been building, sent Leclerc off into this nether plane where the star vampire is trapped. Now, Weiss suspects that he may have accidentally gotten Leclerc in trouble about this book, and he is afraid to say anything to anyone about it because he might incriminate himself. But he's also been working on his own version of Leclerc's vanish trick because, yeah, he was planning on stealing it, but he has since decided against using that for the charity show. He's going to instead focus on his big vanishing ducks trick. Now, one complaint that I have with this adventure is that it is trying a little too hard here for the investigators not to learn any of this stuff until the big reveal at the charity event at the end. Now, that's why we have this guard who's stationed outside the practice room at all times, why the practice room is locked, why there is no key anywhere to be found for them to get inside of it. And the adventure says to discourage the players from going inside this room. Which you know for a fact that any room that the game master does not want the players to enter is gonna be the one room that they obsess about entering more than anything else and ignoring everything else in the freaking adventure in order to do it. Now, one thing this adventure desperately needs is a written out timeline. It's almost as if they intentionally made piecing together the timeline of events as difficult as possible for keepers to do. So I put together this one as a way of keeping it all straight as the players, pieced together the events, and I wanted to make sure that I had the dates right whenever the player characters were asking about them. The finale occurs at the Mermaid Theater on the 28th. Now, due to some recent bombings and high-profile guests who are going to be attending, security is going to be extra tight, and getting weapons inside is going to be tough if you were a guest, but it might be a little bit easier if you're going to be one of the performers or coming in with the performers, because you might be able to hide that in your props and make it look like, anything in there was somehow involved in a magic trick that was going to be used for the show. Now, the crates from the locked practice room have all been moved to the backstage area, giving the investigators their easiest opportunity so far to open them up and peek inside and see what the hell is going on in here. Now, when they do, the ghostly burning visage of Leclerc just springs out, and he begs the investigators to release him from this terrible place that he's inside of. He tells them that they must let Sue begin the ceremony in order for him to escape, but then they must stop him before it is released, as it is hungry. Guys, you were a freaking thing that he said because I was too busy screaming. For the show's finale, Ching Lung Su takes the stage, the big gate apparatus being set up behind him now. After a few minor tricks, some of them being with real magic that he's performing for these people, he begins his final trick. So, robed cultists, they join him out on the stage, beginning all their low chants, and then Leclerc, kind of in this, suddenly just appears suspended in the air, floating above this gate, and just bursts into flames. So as smoke is filling the stage area, something starts moving within the gate as the star vampire begins materializing and coming through. Now for my game, I changed this part up quite a bit, and I took a lot of cues from the Prospero House remix. They did a fantastic job making this thing a lot more cinematic. So I had Sue bring Carl Weiss out onto stage for this, and Carl, who was thrilled because he believed that he was going to be part of this big final act with Sue, who was his hero. So he lays on this table before the gate, and then Jade Ling comes out and she kind of folds the panels of this table up into this box with his head sticking out, and then she rotates the box upright. So it's kind of this upright box with his head sticking out of the top. And then she kind of pulls a sword out of her mouth and she hands that to Sue, who then just chops Carl's head clean off. And his head just rolls off and falls into this kind of open urn that looks like a dragon head with its mouth open. And, the whole crowd just gasps at this. Oh, yeah, because at the time, most of us were just off stage at the time, and he's in his little box with his head sticking out. He's grinning and smiling and just so excited to be part of this grand finale with Ching Long Su, and at least he died happy. Now, any player characters who might be hiding up in the rafters above, they can see down into this box and they can see Carl's severed neck and the blood flowing out of it. And then all of a sudden, this bright red smoke just starts pouring out of the hole in the top of the box and out of this vase, which is actually his blood aerosoling. So anyone looking down on this, they're going to lose sanity. But from the audience's point of view, it just looks like this dramatic red stage smoke that's pouring out. And then the box, it unfolds, revealing Leclerc just floating in the air, and then Leclerc catches on fire. Anyway, so the player characters, they only have a brief window of time once Leclerc solidifies his form and he's free, and that's when they can step in and stop this ceremony. Now, for my game, and because it was Pulp Cthulhu, I gave them only 2 rounds to do this, to either injure Sue so he stops the ceremony, knock over or break the gate. Even they could kill Leclerc if they decided to. In regular Call of Cthulhu, I might extend this out to 4, maybe 5 rounds is all they have in order to stop this ceremony. Now, once this summoned, the Star Vampire, which is completely invisible at first, I had it where it was visible when it was inside the gate, but when it came into our world, it went invisible again. So it floats out into the crowd, and then it just starts grabbing some random audience member and begins draining them of all their blood. And as the blood is flowing through into this creature, it makes this noodly horror of the Star Vampire visible for everyone to see. Now, of course, the audience is going to be freaking the hell out at this, and some of them are going to panic, a few of them are going to go insane, and they're going to start surging towards the exits. So the cops and the guards, they're going to be kind of fighting through the surge of people trying to get up to the stage, trying to stop this. And this should be a pretty rather exciting scene to do. Now, once the summoning has been interrupted, Sue is going to try to escape, fleeing through a trap door and then just running out the back of the theater. Now, the player characters, they might be able to catch him at the house where he's going to go and gather all his stuff. Otherwise, he is just going to escape. And once Leclerc is saved and the ceremony is either stopped or the Star Vampire is defeated, the adventure is done. Overall, I really do enjoy this adventure. I like the whole story of the cult and how he went off and he learned from it, stole everything from him, and then the cult followed him back to London. I dig the idea of the player characters joining this big magician's club and maybe even the players having to do actual magic tricks in order to be inducted into it. I like the ceremony that takes place on a stage with a Star Vampire ravaging this audience, some of which being, the Prime Minister or some of the royal family. I like how all the suspicion is initially put on Weiss, but he's more of this innocent jerk, and in my game, he was more of a hapless victim than anything else. In fact, when I first got into Call of Cthulhu, I read this adventure and I knew I wanted to run it. However, when I saw that it suggested that you run this with Cthulhu by Gaslight, I decided that I was going to wait until the new 7th edition Gaslight release, so it only took me like 10 years to finally run this adventure from when I decided that I wanted to run this adventure, so yeah, my 2-run pile is pretty damn long. So when people are always asking me, Seth, this new adventure released, how long is it going to take you to run this thing and do a review of it? 10 years is entirely plausible. I'm slow. However, there are several issues with this adventure. Apart from the railroady bits, the layout for this thing is super duper difficult to follow with the backstory and the explanation of everything that's going on. It's just spread out all over the place, and there's no clear timeline of events that the keepers can follow, so it leaves the keepers really having to search through this module just to find certain information. The organization of it is just simply terrible. I mean, there's no other way of putting it. Terrible, terrible organization. Now, thankfully, the Prospero House Remix, which didn't exist 10 years ago when I initially decided I was going to run this, they really leaned this adventure up and they got it really, really easy to follow, and they put it in a good format that keepers could easily reference, which I then took that and then I redid it and I cleaned it up a little bit further when I ran this thing. So once again, links below for my version and their version, and you can decide whichever one you want to use or modify them or whatever it is you want to do. Another thing with this adventure is it gives 2 illustrations of this vanish trick, the handout that Horn gives them at the very beginning of the adventure, and then this random illustration that appears inside the module, which I don't know if this is supposed to be of the trick or just some illustration they found in an old magic book for flavor, or if it's supposed to be important or not, but neither of these look like the device with the gate that the ceremony is involving with. So that's why I had it when I did the ceremony, the box turned upright. That way it looked very similar to the illustration, but the module makes a point how the ceremony uses a device that Leclerc was trying to copy for his trick, but we never really learn what that device is, and it just kind of added more questions than it did answers. Unfortunately, the biggest problem with this adventure is that it has been out of print for decades. There never were any official PDFs made of it since the adventure predates the existence of PDFs, and used physical copies, if you're looking on eBay or used bookstores, they can get pretty expensive because you're dealing with collector's prices. Now, I heard through the rumor mill of a couple reliable contacts that I have that Games Workshop was approached by a different gaming company about seeing about maybe if they could purchase these from them and re-release and sell the rights to them of these older Call of Cthulhu stuff that Games Workshop used to release, but that didn't work out simply because no one at Games Workshop even knows exactly who owns the rights to all their stuff in order to sell it. You know, the game writer contracts, you know, they were all in the 80s, so they were a little bit different than they are today. At this point, they're 40-year-old contracts that were probably hand-signed on paper somewhere in some lost filing cabinet, even if they still exist. So it is very unlikely that we are ever going to have a reprint of these adventures, which really breaks my heart that a lot of the older gaming stuff out there, especially a lot of the older licensed gaming stuff out there where you're dealing with multiple owners of the property as the actual IP owner and then whoever it was that released the gaming supplement, you know, they kind of fall between the cracks in this kind of legally gray area somewhere, and they just get lost to time and nobody ever gets to see them again. But if you can find a used copy of this adventure, or maybe one of the unofficial scanned PDFs somewhere, I'm not going to tell you where, I recommend that you check the Vanishing Conjurer out. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. You want to see some more of our stuff such as game reviews, RPG philosophy, just hit that subscribe button. Till next time, investigators, you have a great day. You know, is this your card? No, it's not. Damn it.